poor girl stole from a millionaire, he followed her. But when he saw what she intended to do, he began to cry. Jonathan Carter walked through the bustling streets of Manhattan on a crisp winter morning. Impeccably dressed in a tailored suit and an Italian wool scarf, he was the very image of success. Yet his expression was distant. The towering buildings and the ceaseless honking of cars faded into the background as he mentally rehearsed for an important meeting scheduled for later that day. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Then, something peculiar happened. A young woman, dressed in tattered clothes with hands reddened from the cold, crossed his path. Jonathan barely noticed her as she lightly bumped into him, mumbling an apology before disappearing into the crowd. Distracted, he continued on his way, completely unaware that his wallet was no longer in his possession. The vibrant New York City landscape remained unshaken, but something about her eyes, those fleeting seconds when they locked with his, etched itself into his memory. They held a blend of sorrow, desperation, and, curiously, determination. Jonathan shook his head, refocusing on what he deemed important at the moment, blissfully ignorant that this brief encounter would change his life forever. Jonathan stepped into a nearby coffee shop, his usual refuge during New York's hectic mornings. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the inviting warmth of the room offered a welcome reprieve from the biting cold outside. He ordered his usual cappuccino, reaching into his inner coat pocket for his wallet to pay. It wasn't there. For a moment, he considered the possibility that he had left it at home, a highly unlikely scenario for someone as meticulous as he was. He checked every pocket, rifled through his leather briefcase, and even asked the barista if it had fallen on the counter. Nothing. Then, the memory of that fleeting encounter with the young woman resurfaced. The way she had hurriedly bumped into him now seemed less accidental and more deliberate. A wave of frustration washed over him. It wasn't just the loss of money that stung, it was the feeling of being deceived. The wallet contained not only his credit cards and important documents, but also a cherished photo of his late mother, an irreplaceable memento of immense sentimental value. Clenching his fists, Jonathan resolved to find the culprit. There was something about that girl that intrigued him, something that made him want to uncover more than just the whereabouts of his stolen belongings. He left the coffee shop with purpose, his eyes scanning the crowd with newfound intensity. Jonathan moved swiftly along the crowded sidewalks, scrutinizing every face. The chaotic rhythm of New York offered no favors for his search, but he refused to give up. He recalled her shabby clothing, her disheveled hair, and those weary, haunted eyes. These details played in his mind as he scoured every corner, peered into shops, and examined dimly lit alleyways. At last, he spotted a familiar figure entering a small, quieter park. It was her. He recognized the way she kept her hood pulled low over her face, as if trying to melt into the background. Without hesitation, Jonathan followed, maintaining a safe distance. His initial anger began to wane, replaced by an overwhelming curiosity. There was something more to this girl than the crime she had committed, and he was determined to find out what it was. He saw her stop near a group of dirty, poorly dressed children sitting on an old wooden bench. Emily, as he would later learn her name, pulled something from her pocket and handed it to the children. Jonathan couldn't quite make out what it was, but the smiles on their faces caught him off guard. He hadn't expected to witness a moment of tenderness from someone who had just stolen from him. What she did next, however, left him even more bewildered. Emily began walking out of the park, glancing around as if she were looking for someone. There was something restless, almost desperate, about her posture. Jonathan continued following her, his emotions now a whirlwind of confusion. Who was this girl and what was really going on? Jonathan trailed Emily through the quieter streets of the city. She walked briskly, as if fleeing from something or on an urgent mission. Her footsteps echoed off the narrow walls as she entered a poorly lit alley filled with wooden crates and garbage bins. Jonathan hesitated for a moment before deciding to follow her. At the far end of the alley, Emily stopped. She seemed to be counting the money from Jonathan's wallet, but her expression wasn't one of relief or satisfaction. It was one of worry and fear. Before she could do anything else, Jonathan confronted her. "Hey!" His voice was firm but measured. Emily spun around quickly, clutching the wallet against her chest as if it were a shield. Her wide eyes reflected a mix of surprise and terror. "Please, I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she stammered, her voice shaky but heavy with emotion. Jonathan hadn't expected this reaction. He had prepared himself to face someone cynical, maybe even defiant, but what he encountered was vulnerability. "That doesn't belong to you," he said, striving to remain calm. "Why did you do this?" Emily hesitated, glancing toward the alley's exit as if calculating an escape route. But realizing that Jonathan wasn't about to back down, she exhaled deeply. "I had to. For them," she said, nodding her head in the direction of the park they had come from. "The kids. They're hungry, and I didn't have another choice." The sincerity in her voice gave Jonathan pause. He was still angry, but he began to understand that this situation was far more complicated than a simple theft. Jonathan stood silent for a moment, trying to process what Emily had just said. Her explanation, though unexpected, sounded genuine. He looked at the young woman before him once more. The worn-out coat, the nearly falling apart shoes, and the exhausted expression on her face told a story of hardship he, in his privileged life, had never known. "Did you really have no other choice?" Jonathan finally broke the silence, his voice now softer, almost a whisper. "Is stealing the only way?" Emily swallowed hard, clutching the wallet tightly. Her eyes glistened, but she refused to let the tears fall. When you've gone days without eating, watching children beg for something you can't give them, choices disappear. "It's not right, I know," she said, taking a deep breath to steady herself. "But right and wrong don't put food on the table." Jonathan could tell this wasn't an empty excuse. She spoke of a reality he had never experienced. "These kids," he began, hesitating. "Are they yours?" Emily shook her head slowly. "No, but they're all I have left." She paused, her voice growing rougher. "I found them months ago, on the streets. They had no one, nothing, and I couldn't leave them." Jonathan felt something shift inside him. He had started this pursuit with anger, but now, instead of indignation, he felt something else entirely: compassion. He looked at Emily with fresh eyes, as if seeing the true depth of her struggle for the first time. "So it's for them," he said, more to himself than to her. Emily nodded, visibly uncomfortable. Admitting her situation to a stranger, especially one who clearly came from a world so far removed from hers, was no easy feat. "Turn me in if you want," she said suddenly, lifting her chin defiantly. "Just let me buy something for them first." Jonathan stood still, studying her. In that moment, he realized that this young woman, whom he had initially pegged as a criminal, was in truth a desperate protector. He didn't respond immediately. His eyes moved between the wallet in Emily's hands and her tense, exhausted face. He sensed there was more behind her words, something she wasn't yet revealing. So, he began slowly, carefully choosing his words. "What were you going to do with the money?" "Just food." Emily hesitated, pressing her lips together before replying. It was as if she were deciding how much she could trust this man who, despite everything, was still standing there, listening to her. "Food, yes," she said, holding his gaze. "But it's not just that. I owe money. To a man. A dangerous man. He gave me until today to pay him back." Jonathan tilted his head, now more intrigued than angry. "And what happens if you don't pay?" Emily let out a short, humorless laugh. "You don't want to know. But let me put it this way, he won't come after me. "He'll go after them," she said, referring to the children. Her voice wavered slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "And I can't let that happen." Jonathan felt the weight of her words hit him. He looked at the wallet in her hands and realized its contents were more than just a material loss for him. They were a matter of survival for Emily. "How many kids?" he asked, crossing his arms. For Emily replied almost immediately. "Molly's 8. The twins, Ethan and Emma, are 6, and Ava just turned 4. Jonathan quickly did the math in his head. The amount she had stolen didn't seem nearly enough to cover a debt, feed for children, and protect them from someone dangerous. "And you're doing all of this alone?" he asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. Emily simply nodded. "Someone has to." Jonathan exhaled deeply. He was beginning to understand that this was far bigger than he had imagined. This wasn't just about money. It was about lives, about someone who had to fight for 4 abandoned children while also protecting herself. He realized he couldn't just walk away and forget what he was hearing. Jonathan was still processing Emily's words when the sound of footsteps echoed at the entrance of the alley. Both of them turned quickly, and he saw the expression of pure panic on her face. A tall, burly man stepped out of the shadows, his worn leather jacket and intimidating glare giving him an air of menace. "You're taking your time, Emily," the man said, his deep voice slicing through the silence. He seemed to ignore Jonathan entirely, his focus locked on her. "Where's the money?" Emily took a step back, still clutching Jonathan's wallet. I have it." "Here it is," she stammered, extending the wallet with trembling hands. Jonathan froze for a moment, watching the scene unfold. The realization that she had stolen to pay off a debt now had a face. A threatening, dangerous face that didn't look like it would hesitate to make good on its threats. "That'll cover half at best," the man growled, snatching the wallet roughly from Emily's hands. "You know what that means, don't you?" Emily tried to speak, but her voice failed her. Jonathan, who had been silently trying to piece together the situation, finally stepped forward. "Wait," he said, his voice steady and controlled. The man stopped and turned, glaring at him with disdain. "How much does she owe?" The man raised an eyebrow, as if sizing Jonathan up for the first time. "What's it to you?" he replied, his voice dripping with contempt. "Just answer," Jonathan insisted, taking a step closer. After a brief pause, the man named a figure that made Jonathan's brow furrow. It was an exorbitant amount, clearly far beyond anything someone like Emily could earn without resorting to desperate measures. Jonathan sighed, pulling his phone from his pocket. "I'll transfer the full amount, right now." "But you leave her and the kids alone," he said, his words more a command than a suggestion. Emily stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. "No, you don't have to," she began, but Jonathan cut her off. "Yes, I do," he said, not taking his eyes off the man. "And I'm going to make sure this ends here." The man hesitated, but the prospect of getting the full payment without further hassle seemed appealing. After a few tense minutes of negotiation, the transfer was made, and the man walked away without so much as a glance back. When silence returned to the alley, Emily turned to Jonathan, tears welling in her eyes. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice low and thick with emotion. "Because no one should have to carry this weight alone," he replied, feeling something shift within him, something he didn't yet fully understand. The silence hanging in the alley was heavy, laden with unspoken emotions. Emily kept her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if trying to shield herself from something invisible, while Jonathan stood beside her, imposing yet free of arrogance. He knew what he had just done was only a step, not the solution to Emily's and the children's struggles. "Will he come back?" Jonathan asked, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a resolute edge that couldn't be ignored. Emily shook her head, her shoulders visibly tense. "Not because of this debt. But men like him always find a way to demand more. Whether it's money, favors, or fear, she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Jonathan exhaled deeply. It was a cruel cycle, and he knew that simply paying off one debt wasn't enough to break these chains. He observed Emily more closely now, noticing how much her posture revealed. Exhaustion, constant vigilance, and yet a quiet strength. "This has to stop, Emily," he said, stepping closer to her. "Not just for you. For them too." Emily looked at him, surprised. She wasn't used to anyone caring this much about her or the children. "And what do you suggest?" she asked, a faint note of skepticism in her voice. Jonathan paused to think. He had never been in a situation like this before, but he understood that his resources could be a powerful tool if used correctly. "First, you and the kids need a safe place to stay. Not a temporary shelter, but something stable. Then we figure out how to sever any ties you still have with people like that man. And if you're willing, we find a way for you to start over." Emily laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of joy. "You talk like it's easy, like you could snap your fingers and everything would change." "It's not easy," Jonathan admitted, meeting her gaze directly. "But you don't have to do this alone." His tone was firm, yet it carried something Emily wasn't used to recognizing. Sincerity. She wanted to protest, to say she didn't need help, but the truth was, she was at her breaking point. The sleepless nights, the daily struggles to protect the kids, and the constant sense of danger had worn her down in ways she could hardly describe. After a long moment of silence, Emily finally nodded. Her eyes filled with a mix of relief and hesitation. "Okay," she said softly, "but that doesn't mean it'll be easy." Jonathan gave her a faint smile, one that seemed to promise that no matter how hard it was, he wouldn't give up. Shortly after leaving the alley, Jonathan hailed a taxi and, without giving Emily a chance to protest, instructed the driver to take them to a nearby hotel. During the ride, Emily remained silent, her eyes fixed on the cityscape rushing past the window. Jonathan, on the other hand, occasionally glanced at her, trying to decipher what might be going through her mind. When they arrived at the hotel, Emily hesitated at the entrance. The lobby, with its gleaming marble floors and grand chandeliers, felt like a universe far removed from her reality. She looked at Jonathan, confused. "Why are you doing this?" she finally asked, her voice low but thick with emotion. Jonathan stopped, turning to face her with a serious expression. "Because no one deserves to live on the edge like you're living. And honestly, I think I can help." Emily crossed her arms, as though trying to shield herself from the weight of his words. "You don't know me," she said defensively. "You don't know what I've done or who I am." Jonathan took a deep breath, holding back his frustration. "I know enough," he replied. "I know you risked your life for those kids. I know you've been fighting alone for a long time. That's more than most people would ever do." She averted her gaze, but he pressed on. "You know what I think?" he continued. "I think you're so used to fighting alone that you can't even imagine what it would be like to have help." His words struck her like a blow. Jonathan noticed the glint of tears in her eyes, but Emily quickly blinked, trying to hide them. "And what if you're wrong?" she asked, almost challenging him. "What if I don't deserve this?" Jonathan stepped closer, meeting her gaze directly. "Then prove me right. Not for me, but for them," he said, referring to the children. There was a long silence before Emily finally nodded, reluctantly. Jonathan booked a room, and before long, Emily found herself standing in front of a comfortable bed, something she hadn't experienced in months. "This is temporary," Jonathan said as he placed the room key on the table. "Tomorrow we'll figure out the next steps." Emily looked at him, her defenses still present, but there was something different in her eyes. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Jonathan nodded and left, giving her space to grapple with her thoughts and the layers of mistrust that were slowly starting to peel away. That night, Jonathan returned to his apartment, but the luxury and silence that once brought him comfort now felt suffocating. He collapsed onto his brown leather sofa, staring out the window at the dazzling New York skyline. Despite the city's beauty, his thoughts were fixed on Emily and the children. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but before bringing it to his lips, he paused. Something was different. Jonathan felt a weight that wasn't from the drink or physical exhaustion. It was a moral discomfort, as though he was seeing, for the first time, the stark disparity between his life and that of so many others. He had always prided himself on his generous donations to charities, but now he realized how impersonal and detached those gestures had been. He remembered Emily's expression when she thanked him earlier. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a blend of relief and vulnerability. Jonathan couldn't shake the thought that while he lived in a world where problems could be solved with a click or a phone call, she faced battles for survival every single day. Abruptly, he stood and began pacing the room, as if movement might help him sort through his thoughts. When his eyes fell on the shelf of trophies and awards he had accumulated throughout his career, an overwhelming sense of emptiness washed over him. What did any of it really mean? He had built financial empires but had never questioned whether he was leaving behind something that truly mattered. Jonathan picked up his phone and called his assistant. "I need some information," he said, "on shelters and assistance programs for mothers and children in New York." His assistant, caught off guard by the unexpected request, quickly agreed to look into it. After hanging up, Jonathan exhaled deeply, realizing he was only beginning to grasp the magnitude of what he had committed to. He knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was about to do something that truly mattered. The next morning, Jonathan woke up early, determined to turn his reflections into concrete actions. After reviewing the information his assistant had gathered, he found details about local organizations that provided support for homeless mothers and children. Among them, one program stood out, a comprehensive initiative that offered temporary housing, legal assistance, and professional training. Without wasting time, Jonathan scheduled a meeting to learn how he could make a meaningful contribution. Meanwhile, at the hotel, Emily woke up feeling a mix of relief and confusion. It had been her first night in a long time spent somewhere safe, but the reality of her situation still loomed over her. She knew she needed to pick up the children soon, but as she headed down to the lobby, she found Jonathan waiting for her with 2 cups of coffee. "Good morning, Emily. I hope you slept well," he said, extending one of the cups to her. Emily accepted the coffee and sat down cautiously. There was a glimmer of gratitude in her eyes, but the remnants of mistrust, built over years of struggling alone, were still there. "Thank you. It was the best night's sleep I've had in a long time," she replied hesitantly. Jonathan seized the moment to explain the meeting he had scheduled and his plans to help her and the children. He outlined his vision of finding a stable solution, something more than just a temporary fix, something that could offer them a foundation for a fresh start. Emily listened quietly, her fingers tightening around the coffee cup as she processed his words. "I don't know what to say," she began, her voice almost breaking. "I'm not used to relying on anyone. I'm not asking you to rely on me forever," Jonathan said with an encouraging smile. "I'm just offering help so you can move forward." After a long pause, Emily nodded, visibly moved. For the first time, the idea of a new beginning felt like more than just a distant dream. The meeting Jonathan had arranged took place in a modest but functional building in the heart of New York. He and Emily were greeted by a woman named Sarah Mitchell, the coordinator of a local social assistance program. Sarah was an experienced professional, with a warm and practical demeanor that quickly put Emily at ease. After listening to Emily's story and learning about the children's situation, Sarah presented several options. One included a small apartment in a community housing complex where Emily could live with the children while receiving psychological support and attending professional training courses. "It's a start," Sarah said with an encouraging smile. "It won't solve everything, but it will help build a solid foundation for a new future." Emily listened carefully, but her expression remained cautious. The idea seemed almost too good to be true. Jonathan, noticing her hesitation, stepped in. I can cover the initial costs, he said firmly. Whatever it takes to ensure that you and the kids are safe. Emily turned to him, surprised. Jonathan, I can't accept this. You've already done so much for us. This isn't charity, Emily, he replied calmly. It's about making sure you have a fair chance. Sarah spoke up, her tone gentle yet resolute. Emily, you're not alone. It's normal to feel like you're accepting more than you deserve. But no one should have to carry this much weight alone. Emily lowered her gaze, touched by Sarah's words and Jonathan's determination. After a moment of silence, she finally nodded. All right, she said with a faint smile. Let's try. Later, as they walked back to the hotel, Jonathan noticed that Emily seemed more at ease, though she still carried an undercurrent of caution. What did you think? He asked, genuinely curious. It's scary, she admitted, staring straight ahead. But for the first time in a long time, it feels like there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Jonathan smiled, pleased. It's just the beginning, Emily. But I believe you can do this. Emily glanced at him for a moment, unsure of how to express her gratitude. Instead of words, she simply nodded, allowing herself to believe, however cautiously, that he might be right. The days that followed brought a new rhythm to Emily and the children's lives. They moved into the small apartment within the community complex. Though modest, it was clean and safe. Jonathan helped furnish the space with essentials but let Emily choose the details, respecting her autonomy. The children quickly adapted to their new environment. Molly, with her insatiable curiosity, explored every corner of the apartment. The twins, Ethan and Emma, began playing freely in the complex's park. Little Ava, who had been more reserved at first, soon started smiling more often, especially after receiving her first doll. For Emily, however, the transition was more complicated. Though grateful for the safety and support, she wrestled with a persistent feeling of inadequacy. The therapy sessions offered by the program unearthed painful memories of her past. Losing her parents in an accident, the bankruptcy that left her with nothing, and the lonely journey that forced her to harden her heart to survive. Jonathan visited regularly but respected Emily's space. He knew his presence was both a comfort and a reminder of the help she had accepted, something that still made her uncomfortable. How are things? He asked one afternoon as they sipped coffee in her small kitchen. One day at a time, Emily replied, stirring her coffee absently. Sometimes I wonder if I'm up to all this. Jonathan studied her carefully, choosing his words with care. You are up to it. No one expects you to have all the answers right away, Emily. The strength you've shown in taking care of these kids, that already speaks volumes about who you are. She looked at him for a moment, her eyes shining with a mixture of emotion and doubt. It's still hard to trust, you know? It's always been me against the world. And now, suddenly, there are so many people trying to help. Feels strange. Jonathan nodded, understanding. Strange, maybe, but you don't have to fight alone to prove your strength. Accepting help is also an act of courage. Those words stayed with Emily long after Jonathan left. She realized that the path to recovery wasn't just about finding a safe place or securing food and clothing. It was also about allowing herself to trust, not just others, but herself. As the weeks went by, Emily began to open up little by little. The support from therapy sessions and constant interaction with other families in the community complex brought a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. Belonging. Jonathan continued to visit her regularly, often bringing things he knew the children would enjoy, like storybooks for Molly or a painting kit for the twins. Despite his apparent ease with the children, Emily began to notice that he, too, was changing. She saw a vulnerability in him, hidden beneath his confident and generous exterior. One quiet afternoon, while the children played in the community park, Emily and Jonathan sat on a nearby bench. You know so much about me, Emily said, watching the children play in the distance. But I hardly know anything about you. Jonathan chuckled, a light sound tinged with melancholy. There's not much to know. I grew up in a wealthy family, had every opportunity anyone could ask for, built a career, made a name for myself, and lost my mom far too early." Emily turned to him, surprised. "I'm so sorry." "Thank you," he said, pausing as he gazed at the sky, now painted in shades of orange by the setting sun. "She was the one who taught me the value of caring for others. When I lost her, I think I shut down. I poured all my energy into work and distanced myself from what really matters." Emily listened in silence, absorbing the sincerity in his words. "It's funny," she said after a moment. "We've both lost so much, but in different ways. And somehow it brought us here." Jonathan nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "Maybe that's why I wanted to help," he said softly. "Because I saw in you a strength I once needed to find in myself." For a moment, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but filled with mutual understanding. Later, as Jonathan prepared to leave, Emily walked him to the entrance of the complex. "Thank you for today," she said sincerely. "Not just for everything you've done for the kids, but for listening to me." Jonathan smiled, a smile that seemed more genuine than any she'd ever seen from him. "Anytime, Emily. Always." As he walked away, Emily realized that, for the first time, she felt she could fully trust someone. Not because it was easy, but because she knew he was willing to stand by her, even during the hardest moments. With Jonathan's help and the community program's support, Emily began to rebuild her life. She was accepted into an administrative training course, something she had never imagined doing, but which now felt like an essential step toward independence. At first, she struggled to adjust. The technical terms, the fast pace of the classes, and the challenge of balancing studies with caring for the children left her exhausted. But she was no longer alone. Sarah, from the community program, offered constant guidance, and Jonathan visited regularly, bringing words of encouragement and occasionally helping the kids with their schoolwork or reading bedtime stories to them. The impact of the new routine on the children was transformative. Molly, ever curious, began showing an interest in books and even declared she wanted to become a writer. Ethan and Emma displayed a knack for art, turning their painting kits into creations that adorned the apartment walls. Ava, the youngest, finally seemed secure enough to play without fear, something that deeply moved Emily's heart. One Saturday afternoon, Emily organized a small picnic in the complex's park to celebrate her first few weeks in the course. Jonathan was invited, and when he arrived, he found the children running happily while Emily sat on a checkered blanket, laughing as she watched them. "This is new," he said, pointing to her smile as he approached. Emily laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to brighten her entire face. "Maybe I'm starting to believe things can work out," she replied. They spent the afternoon talking and playing with the kids, and for a moment, everything felt normal, almost like a family. As the sun began to set, Emily looked at Jonathan, her expression serious but calm. "I never thought I'd get here," she said. "And if it weren't for you, I wouldn't have." Jonathan shook his head. "No, Emily, I just showed you a path. The rest was you, your strength, your determination." She smiled, knowing he was right, but still grateful to have him by her side. Later that night, as Emily tucked Ava into bed, she felt a peace she hadn't known in a long time. Jonathan, sitting on the couch, helped Molly organize her books while the twins proudly showed off their drawings. For the first time, Emily felt that the future was no longer a threat but a promise. Months passed and Emily graduated from the training program. At a small ceremony organized by the community program, she received her certificate with the children sitting proudly in the front row. Molly clapped enthusiastically while Ethan and Emma waved drawings they had made to mark the occasion. Ava, sitting in Jonathan's arms, clapped along with a contagious smile. After the ceremony, Emily was approached by one of the organizers, who offered her a position at a local office as an administrative assistant. The job was exactly what she needed, a stable starting point to continue rebuilding her life. That evening, Jonathan invited everyone to dinner at a cozy restaurant, far removed from the glamour that usually surrounded his life. During the meal, the children excitedly shared stories about school and their plans for the holidays, while Emily, for the first time, appeared completely at ease. "Emily," Jonathan said, interrupting the chatter during a quiet moment, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened these past few months, about everything you've done to get here." She looked at him curiously, as Molly and the twins watched her intently. "I want you to know that it's not just you who's changed," he continued, his voice sincere. "You and the kids have taught me something money could never buy. How to find purpose, how to truly be part of someone's life." Emily didn't respond immediately, but her eyes filled with tears. "You gave us a chance when no one else would," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll never forget that." Jonathan smiled, but before he could respond, Molly chimed in with the confidence only a child could have. "Can you be our Uncle Jonathan forever?" she asked, eliciting laughter from everyone at the table. "Of course, Molly," he said, laughing. "Forever." At the end of the evening, while Emily tucked the kids into bed in their apartment, Jonathan remained in the living room, taking in the walls now adorned with drawings and photos. The space that had once felt temporary now overflowed with life. Emily returned to the living room and sat next to him on the sofa. "So," she began hesitantly, "what comes next?" Jonathan looked at her with a calm smile. "Whatever comes, Emily. But I know that whatever it is, you're ready." She smiled back, feeling a mix of relief and excitement for what the future held. In that moment, they both realized that the journey they had shared wasn't an ending but a new beginning. Emily had discovered a strength she never imagined she had, and Jonathan had rediscovered what truly mattered in life. Together, they had created something neither of them would ever forget: a family built not by blood, but by love and the determination to persevere. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and a comment. Let me know which city you're watching this video from. A big hug, and see you in the next story.